"Get her out now. She doesn't belong." The store manager's voice echoed through the luxury boutique as security guards grabbed the elegantly dressed black woman by her arms. "People like you don't belong here," sneered the sales associate, his face twisted with disgust as customers stopped and stared. But what happened next changed everything. The black woman being dragged toward the exit didn't scream. She didn't fight. She didn't even raise her voice. Instead, she looked directly at the store manager with eyes that could cut through steel and said just 7 words that would haunt them forever. "You have no idea what you just did." What these employees didn't know was that the woman they just threw out like yesterday's trash was one that shouldn't be played with. The store manager who screamed at her, the sales associate who said she didn't belong, the security guards who put their hands on her, they had no idea that their entire world was about to collapse. Because when you humiliate the wrong person, when you judge someone by the color of their skin instead of the content of their character, when you forget that respect costs nothing but means everything, the universe has a way of serving justice on a silver platter. If you're ready to see what happens when karma comes knocking at full speed, make sure you hit that subscribe button because this story is about to get absolutely wild. But first, if you believe everyone should be respected, type respect in the comments and tell us where you're watching from. You will definitely get a heartwarming reply. To understand just how devastating this moment was about to become, you need to know who the black woman, Dennis Sterling, really was. At 42 years old, she was the definition of self-made success. That morning, she had stepped out of her luxury Mercedes, impeccably dressed in a tailored blazer and designer heels, preparing to visit her newest store location for the very first time. But Dennis's journey to this moment hadn't been easy. Growing up in foster care, bouncing from home to home, she learned early that the world wouldn't hand her anything. While other kids were worrying about prom dates, Dennis was working 3 jobs just to pay for college. She stocked shelves at night, served coffee in the morning, and cleaned offices on weekends. Sleep was a luxury she couldn't afford, but giving up was never an option. Her empire started with a single thrift store that nobody else wanted. Dennis saw potential where others saw junk. She had a vision. Fashion should be accessible, but it should also make people feel powerful, confident, beautiful. That one little thrift store became 2, then 5, then 50. Eventually, she launched Luxe Boutique, her high-end fashion line that would make her millions. But success came with a price. Just 6 months ago, Dennis had gone through a brutal divorce. Her ex-husband couldn't handle her success, couldn't stand that she was the breadwinner, the decision-maker, the boss. The divorce left her emotionally drained, and lately, she'd been using shopping as therapy. Something that used to bring her joy now served as an escape from the loneliness that money couldn't cure. That's exactly why she was here today. This Soho location was her newest flagship store, her expansion into the luxury market she'd always dreamed of conquering. For the past 3 months, while she was in Europe closing international deals and expanding her empire overseas, this store had been operating without her. She'd hired managers she trusted, people who were supposed to represent her values, her vision, her commitment to treating every customer with respect. The store itself was everything Dennis had envisioned. Luxe Boutique Soho was a temple to fashion, gleaming white marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and clothing displays that looked like art installations. This wasn't just a store. It was a statement, a declaration that Dennis had made it to the top of an industry that had tried to keep people like her out. But Dennis had never met the staff running her dream store. Jennifer Walsh, the 38-year-old white store manager, had been hired through a headhunting firm while Dennis was overseas. On paper, Jennifer looked perfect. Years of luxury retail experience, glowing references, a polished resume. What wasn't on that resume was Jennifer's ugly truth. She judged people by their appearance, their race, their perceived social status. To Jennifer, the store was her kingdom, and she decided who was worthy of shopping there. Then there was Brad Morrison, just 26 years old and Jennifer's personal hire. Brad came from money, the kind of entitled, rich white kid who'd never worked a real job in his life. His father had connections in retail, which got him the interview, but it was his ability to kiss up to Jennifer that got him the job. Brad genuinely believed that some people were just better than others, and he had no problem making that clear to customers he deemed unworthy. The security guard, Marcus Thompson, was different. At 35, he was a former military man who just needed steady work to support his family. Marcus followed orders without question, a trait that served him well in the army but was about to make him complicit in something he'd regret for the rest of his life. And then there was Mrs. Catherine Hamilton, a 65-year-old wealthy socialite who spent more money in one shopping trip than most people made in a year. She was the kind of customer Jennifer and Brad worshipped. Old money, white, and willing to drop thousands without blinking. Mrs. Hamilton was their definition of the ideal customer, which made what was about to happen even more telling. Now here's where the story gets interesting. Dennis decided to do something she'd never done before: visit her store incognito. She wanted to see how her employees treated customers when the boss wasn't watching. So instead of arriving in her usual power suit with an entourage of assistants, she dressed casually. Nice clothes, but nothing that screamed, "I own this place." She wanted the real experience, the authentic test of whether her staff actually embodied the values she'd built her company on. The moment Dennis walked through those gleaming glass doors, Jennifer's radar went off. She spotted this well-dressed black woman browsing the expensive section and immediately assumed the worst. Without saying a word, Jennifer caught Brad's eye and gave him the signal. The subtle nod that meant, "Watch this one closely." Dennis was completely unaware of the storm brewing around her. She was genuinely shopping, running her fingers along a gorgeous silk dress, admiring the craftsmanship, feeling proud of what her store offered. This was supposed to be a moment of joy, a CEO admiring her own success. That's when Brad made his move. With a fake smile plastered on his face and condescension dripping from every word, he approached Dennis. "Excuse me, miss," he said, his tone suggesting she was already in the wrong place. "I think you might be more comfortable looking at our more affordable options. We have some lovely pieces on sale in the back." Dennis felt her stomach drop. She'd heard that tone before, felt that judgment, experienced that barely disguised disgust. But she stayed calm. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe she'd misread the situation. So she politely declined and asked to see some of the designer pieces instead. Brad's mask slipped for just a moment. His smile became strained, his voice sharper. "Those pieces are quite expensive," he said, as if explaining basic math to a child. "I'm not sure they're really what you're looking for." And that's when Mrs. Catherine Hamilton walked in. The transformation was instant and nauseating. Jennifer practically sprinted to the door, her face lighting up like Christmas morning. "Mrs. Hamilton, how wonderful to see you. Let me personally show you our newest arrivals." Brad abandoned Dennis mid-conversation, rushing over to fawn over their VIP customer. Dennis stood there, watching this performance, seeing the stark difference in treatment. Mrs. Hamilton was offered champagne, a private viewing room, and the undivided attention of the entire staff. Meanwhile, Dennis, the woman who owned every piece of clothing in that store, who paid every one of their salaries, who had built this empire from nothing, was being treated like a potential shoplifter. The test was working better than Dennis had ever imagined. She was seeing her employees' true color, and they were uglier than she could ever anticipated. But this was just the beginning. What happened next exposed just how deep their prejudice ran, and how spectacularly their world was about to implode. What happened next was about turning this shopping trip into a masterclass in how not to treat customers. Dennis, still trying to give her employees the benefit of the doubt, continued browsing. She found herself drawn to a stunning black evening dress, the kind of piece that commanded attention, that made a statement. The price tag read $3,000. For most people, that would be a month's rent. For Dennis, it was pocket change. But that price tag was about to become the trigger for something ugly. Dennis carefully lifted the dress from its display, admiring the intricate beadwork, the way the fabric caught the light. She'd actually designed pieces similar to this for her European collections. As she held it up to examine the craftsmanship, Brad appeared beside her like a vulture circling prey. "I'm sorry, miss," Brad said, his voice dripping with fake concern, "but I don't think you understand how much that dress costs. It's $3,000. That's quite a lot of money." He said it slowly, like he was explaining calculus to a kindergartner. The condescension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Dennis felt her jaw tighten, but she kept her voice steady. "I can see the price tag," she replied calmly. "I'd like to try it on." Brad's eyes widened in disbelief. He actually laughed, not a polite chuckle, but a genuine laugh of disbelief. "Try it on? Ma'am, I really don't think, do you have $3,000? He asked this question like he already knew the answer, like the very idea was ridiculous. That's when Jennifer decided to join the party. She'd been watching from across the store while simultaneously fawning over Mrs. Hamilton, and she could sense that Brad needed backup. Jennifer approached with the confidence of someone who believed she was doing the right thing, protecting her precious store from an undesirable customer. "Is there a problem here?" Jennifer asked, but she wasn't asking Dennis, she was asking Brad, as if Dennis wasn't even worth acknowledging directly. "She wants to try on the Valentino," Brad said, and the way he said it made it sound like Dennis had asked to burn the place down. Jennifer's eyes narrowed as she looked Dennis up and down, taking in her casual clothes, her skin color, her calm demeanor. "I see," Jennifer said slowly. "Well, we have to be very careful about protecting our store's reputation. These are very expensive pieces, and we can't just let anyone handle them." Let that sink in for a moment. Jennifer just said they can't let anyone handle the merchandise. But what she really meant was, they can't let people who look like Dennis handle the merchandise. Dennis felt something shift inside her chest. This wasn't just bad customer service anymore. This was discrimination, plain and simple. But instead of exploding, instead of pulling out her CEO card and ending this charade, Dennis decided to test them further. She wanted to see exactly how deep this rabbit hole went. "I understand you want to protect your inventory," Dennis said, her voice still calm but with an edge that would have made smart people nervous. "Can you tell me about your store's policies regarding customer service? I'm curious about how you decide who gets to shop here." Brad and Jennifer exchanged a look. They thought they were dealing with someone trying to cause trouble, maybe someone who was going to file a complaint. They had no idea they were talking to the person who wrote those policies. "Our policies are very clear," Jennifer said with authority. "We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone who doesn't meet our clientele standards. This is a luxury boutique, not a department store." Dennis nodded slowly. "Clientele standards," she repeated. "And what exactly determines those standards?" "Well," Brad jumped in, eager to show off in front of his boss, "our VIP customers expect a certain atmosphere. They don't want to be shopping alongside people who might not appreciate the value of what we're offering here." Dennis picked up a business card from the counter, her own company's business card. She studied it like she'd never seen it before, which must have been confusing for Brad and Jennifer. "Luxe Boutique," she read aloud. "Founded on principles of elegance, inclusivity, and respect for all customers." She looked up at them. "That's what this card says. Is that accurate?" Jennifer's face flushed red. She snatched the card out of Dennis's hand so quickly it was almost violent. "We're not hiring," she snapped. "And we certainly don't hire people like, well, we have very specific requirements for our staff." "People like what, Jennifer? Say what you really mean." Dennis felt her composure starting to crack. "I'd like to speak with the owner," she said quietly. That's when Brad made the biggest mistake of his professional life. He threw back his head and laughed like Dennis had just told the funniest joke he'd ever heard. "The owner?" Brad gasped between laughs. "Lady, the owner of this company is a successful businesswoman who built this empire from nothing. She's worth millions of dollars. You think someone like that would waste her time with someone like you?" The irony was so thick, it was suffocating. Here was Dennis, the actual owner, the actual successful businesswoman who built this empire from nothing, being told that she would never waste time with herself. Mrs. Hamilton, who had been receiving the royal treatment just a few feet away, was starting to look uncomfortable. She'd been watching this entire exchange, and something about it didn't sit right with her. You could see the confusion on her face, the growing realization that what she was witnessing wasn't right. But Dennis wasn't done testing her employees. She pulled out her wallet and extracted a platinum credit card. Not just any credit card, but one of those heavy metal cards that banks only give to their wealthiest clients. The kind of card that most people never see in real life. "I'd like to purchase this dress," Dennis said calmly, placing the card on the counter. Jennifer stared at the card like it was a fake ID at a nightclub. She picked it up, held it to the light, examined it from every angle. "This looks suspicious," she announced loudly enough for other customers to hear. "I'm going to need to call for verification." And that's when everything went sideways. Other customers started turning around to see what was happening. The whispers began. Quiet at first, then louder. "Is she trying to use a stolen card? Should we call the police? I can't believe someone would try that in a place like this." Dennis stood there, maintaining her dignity while being publicly humiliated in her own store. The card in Jennifer's hand wasn't just legitimate. It was tied to accounts with more money than Jennifer would see in her lifetime. But instead of processing the transaction, Jennifer was treating Dennis like a criminal. "I'm calling security," Jennifer announced, like she was doing everyone a favor. "This woman is clearly trying to disrupt our business." Marcus, the security guard, appeared so quickly it was obvious he'd been hovering nearby, waiting for this moment. He was a big man, the kind of presence that was meant to intimidate. But as he approached Dennis, you could see the conflict in his eyes. His military training told him to follow orders, but his conscience was screaming that this was wrong. "Ma'am," Marcus said quietly, "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Dennis looked up at him, and for a moment, their eyes met. Marcus saw something there. A dignity, a strength, a calm authority that made him hesitate. But Jennifer was his boss, and he needed this job. "I'm a paying customer," Dennis said quietly. "I haven't done anything wrong." "You're disrupting our business," Jennifer declared triumphantly. "You're making our other customers uncomfortable. You need to leave now, or we'll have you arrested for trespassing." The entire store had gone quiet. Other customers were staring, some pulling out their phones to record. Mrs. Hamilton looked mortified. Not at Dennis, but at what she was witnessing. This was her favorite store, and she was watching them destroy an innocent woman's dignity. Dennis looked around the store one more time. Her store, filled with her merchandise, staffed by her employees who were treating her like garbage. She saw the faces staring at her, some with judgment, some with sympathy, all with curiosity about how this would end. Marcus reached for her arm, gently but firmly. The touch was respectful. He wasn't manhandling her, but he was making it clear that she needed to leave. Dennis didn't resist. She let herself be escorted toward the door, her head held high, her dignity intact, despite everything they'd put her through. But as they reached the door, Dennis stopped. She turned around and looked directly at Jennifer, then at Brad, then let her gaze sweep across the entire store. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of that space. "You'll regret this," she said simply. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't anger. It was a promise delivered with the certainty of someone who knew exactly what was coming next. Jennifer smirked. Brad rolled his eyes. They thought they'd won. They thought they'd successfully protected their precious store from an undesirable customer. They had no idea. They just signed their own professional death warrants. As Dennis walked out onto the Soho sidewalk, her phone was already in her hand. The wheels of justice were about to start turning, and they were going to run over everyone who had participated in this humiliation. Let me ask you something. What would you do if you were in Dennis's shoes? Would you stay calm like she did? Or would you have lost it right there in the store? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and hit the subscribe button now, because trust me, after you hear what she did next, you're going to have some strong opinions about how this should have been handled. The employees thought they'd seen the last of Dennis. They were wrong. In exactly 7 minutes, she was going to walk back through those doors, and when she did, their world was going to explode in ways they never saw coming. Dennis sat in her Mercedes outside the store, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had turned white. For a moment she just breathed. In and out. In and out. The weight of what had just happened was crushing, but it wasn't just about the humiliation. It was about everything that moment represented. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number she knew by heart. "Sarah," she said when her assistant picked up, "we have a problem." Sarah Martinez had been Dennis's right-hand woman for 5 years. She knew her boss's voice better than anyone, and right now, that voice was different. Controlled, but dangerous. "Dennis, what's wrong? Aren't you supposed to be enjoying your shopping trip?" "I was testing the new store," Dennis said quietly. "Sarah, they didn't recognize me." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I'm sorry, what? They didn't recognize you? How is that possible?" "Because," Dennis said, her voice getting harder with each word, "they saw a black woman in casual clothes and decided I didn't belong in my own store. They treated me like trash, Sarah. They had me physically removed." Sarah's gasp was audible. "Dennis, no, please tell me you're joking." "Do I sound like I'm joking?" Dennis asked. "The store manager told me they don't hire people like me." The sales associate laughed when I asked to speak with the owner, said the owner was too successful to waste time with someone like me. They called my platinum card suspicious and had security escort me out. The silence on the other end stretched for what felt like forever. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice shaking with anger. "Those idiots have no idea what they just did, do they?" Dennis closed her eyes, and suddenly she was 12 years old again, standing in a department store with her mother. They'd saved for months to buy Dennis a dress for her school graduation. Her mother had tried to maintain her dignity, just like Dennis had today. She'd asked politely to see the dress, pulled out cash saved from working double shifts. But it didn't matter. They were made to feel small, unwelcome, unworthy. Dennis's mother had died 3 years later, never living to see her daughter build an empire. But she'd made Dennis promise something that day. Someday, she'd whispered as they walked out empty-handed, "You're going to be in a position to make sure this never happens to anyone else." That promise was why Dennis had started Luxe Boutique. Not just to make money, but to create spaces where everyone felt welcome, where dignity and respect weren't luxuries reserved for the wealthy. "This store was supposed to be different, Sarah," Dennis said into the phone. "This store was supposed to represent everything we stand for. Instead, it's become exactly what I built this company to fight against." "What do you want me to do?" Sarah asked, and Dennis could hear her assistant already typing. Dennis's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but every word was crystal clear. "Call the lawyers. Call corporate security. Cancel my meetings. Time to remind them who signs their paychecks." Back inside the store, Jennifer was trying to pretend like nothing had happened. She'd smoothed down her hair, adjusted her blazer, and put on her best customer service smile. But her hands were shaking slightly, and she kept glancing toward the door like she was expecting something bad to happen. That's when David Chen walked in. David was the regional chain manager, a man who'd worked his way up through the company over 15 years. He was known for his surprise inspections, his attention to detail, and his absolute loyalty to Dennis and her vision. Today's visit was supposed to be routine, just to check in on the newest location. The moment David stepped through the door, Jennifer's face went pale. She hadn't been expecting him today, and after what had just happened, his timing couldn't have been worse. "Jennifer," David said with a professional smile. "Good afternoon. How are things going today?" "Oh, Mr. Chen." Jennifer's voice was too bright, too cheerful. "What a wonderful surprise. Everything's going perfectly, just perfectly. We just had a minor situation earlier, but we handled it perfectly. Completely by the book." David had been doing this job for too long not to recognize panic when he saw it. Jennifer was talking too fast, smiling too wide, and there was tension in the air that made his instincts scream danger. He looked around the store. Mrs. Hamilton was still there, but she looked uncomfortable, like she'd witnessed something unpleasant. Marcus, the security guard, looked like a man who wished he could be anywhere else. And Brad kept up avoiding eye contact. "Is everything all right?" David asked slowly. "You seem nervous." "Nervous? Me? No, not at all." Jennifer laughed, but it sounded forced. "We had a troublemaker come in earlier, someone who was clearly trying to cause problems, making our other customers uncomfortable. But don't worry, we removed her before she could disrupt business any further." "Removed her?" David's voice was getting sharper. "Jennifer, what exactly happened here?" Before Jennifer could answer, Mrs. Hamilton stepped forward. She'd been quiet during the entire ordeal earlier, but something about David's questioning gave her the courage to speak up. "Excuse me," Mrs. Hamilton said quietly, "but I was here during the incident. That woman wasn't causing trouble. She was just trying to shop, and your staff treated her terribly." Jennifer's face went red. "Mrs. Hamilton, I appreciate your concern, but you don't understand the full situation. We have to protect our store's reputation." David looked from Jennifer to Mrs. Hamilton and back again. Something was very wrong here. "I want to review the security footage," he said firmly, "right now." That's when Jennifer knew she was in trouble. Real trouble. The security footage would show everything. Every discriminatory comment, every dismissive gesture, every moment of the humiliation they'd put that woman through. "The security footage?" Jennifer stammered. "I'm not sure that's necessary. Like I said, we handled everything perfectly." "Jennifer," David said, his voice cold as ice, "I'm not asking, I'm telling you, show me the footage, now." But before Jennifer could respond, before she could come up with another excuse, the store's front door opened. And Dennis walked in. But this wasn't the casually dressed woman who'd been humiliated and escorted out 30 minutes earlier. This was Dennis, in full CEO mode. She wore a power suit that probably cost more than most people's cars, sharp, black, perfectly tailored, with heels that clicked against the marble floor like a countdown to Judgment Day. Behind her walked 3 people, a woman in an expensive blazer carrying a briefcase, clearly a lawyer, another woman with a tablet and the efficient air of a high-level assistant, and a man in a dark suit who screamed corporate security. The entire store went silent. Not just quiet, silent. The kind of silence that happens when everyone instinctively knows they're about to witness something explosive. David's face went white as a sheet. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. "Miss Sterling," he whispered, like he was seeing a ghost. "But I thought you were." Dennis's voice cut through the air like a blade. "I was. Until your staff threw me out of my own store." Jennifer's knees actually buckled. She grabbed onto the counter to keep from falling. Brad's face drained of all color, his mouth hanging open. Marcus looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Dennis's voice echoed through the store, commanding and absolute. "Everyone stop what you're doing, now." Every person in that store, employees, customers, everyone, froze like they'd been turned to stone. Dennis walked slowly through the store, her heels clicking with each step, until she was standing directly in front of Jennifer. She pointed one perfectly manicured finger at the woman who had humiliated her. "You," Dennis said, her voice so quiet it was terrifying. "The woman who had me escorted out. I'm Dennis Sterling. I own this company." Jennifer tried to speak, but only a strangled whisper came out. But you weren't here when we opened." Dennis's smile was colder than winter. "No, I wasn't here when you opened. Do you know why? Because I was in Europe, building an empire, closing deals worth more money than you'll see in your lifetime, expanding the company that you just tried to ban me from. And while I was doing that, you were here, destroying your career in my newest store. The silence in the store was so complete you could hear people breathing. Mrs. Hamilton let out an audible gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. Dennis continued, her voice carrying to every corner of the store. This store opened with my money. Every piece of clothing you see here exists because of my vision. Every paycheck you've received has my signature on it. And 30 minutes ago you treated me like I didn't belong here. Jennifer was shaking now, actually shaking. Brad looked like he was about to be sick. David looked like he wanted to crawl under a rock and die. Dennis wasn't done. You told me you don't hire people like me. You laughed when I asked to speak with the owner, said she was too successful to waste time with someone like me. You called my credit card suspicious. You had me physically removed from my own store. The weight of their actions was finally hitting them. This wasn't just a customer they'd mistreated. This was the person who could end their careers with a single word. The person who had built everything they were trying to protect from her. And the most disgusting part, Dennis said, her voice rising now, is that you did all of this because of how I look. Because of the color of my skin. Because you decided, based on nothing but your own prejudice, that I didn't belong in a store that exists because of me. Mrs. Hamilton was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she realized she'd witnessed something truly awful. Marcus looked like he was going to be sick. And Jennifer looked like her world had just ended, because it had. What happened next was a masterclass in leadership, justice, and how to handle discrimination with the kind of authority that changes lives forever. Dennis stood in the center of her store, surrounded by the people who had humiliated her, and she was about to deliver a lesson that none of them would ever forget. David Chen, still trying to process the magnitude of what had just been revealed, stepped forward. His face was pale, his hands shaking slightly as he realized he was about to witness his boss systematically dismantle the careers of people who had made the biggest mistake of their professional lives. David, Dennis said, her voice now carrying the full weight of her authority, I want you to hear exactly what happened in my store today. Every single detail. Because this isn't just about these individuals. This is about whether our company stands for anything at all. David nodded, pulling out his phone to record. This wasn't just going to be a termination meeting. This was going to be evidence, documentation, a case study in what happens when prejudice meets consequences. Dennis turned to face Jennifer, who was still gripping the counter like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Let's start with you, Jennifer. The moment I walked into this store, what did you do? Jennifer's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. She knew whatever she said next could either save her career or destroy it completely, but her mind was blank with panic. I was just doing my job, Jennifer finally managed to whisper. Your job, Dennis repeated slowly. Your job was to signal to your sales associate that I was a suspicious customer before I had even touched a single item of merchandise? Your job was to judge me based on my appearance and decide I didn't belong here? We have to be careful, Jennifer said desperately. We have to protect the store's image. We can't just let anyone. Stop. Dennis's voice cut through Jennifer's excuse like a knife through butter. You are not protecting the store's image. You are protecting your prejudices. There is a difference, and that difference just cost you your career. Dennis began walking slowly around the store, her heels clicking against the marble floor, each step deliberate and purposeful. Let me walk you through exactly what happened, David, because I want you to understand the full scope of what went wrong here. She stopped at the dress display where the confrontation had escalated. I picked up a $3,000 dress, a dress that I personally approved for this store's inventory, a dress that represents the kind of quality and craftsmanship that my company is known for. And what happened next, Brad? Brad Morrison looked like he was about to throw up, His face had gone from pale to green, and sweat was beading on his forehead. I just wanted to make sure you understood the price." "You wanted to make sure I understood the price," Dennis repeated, her voice dripping with disdain. "You assumed that a black woman couldn't possibly afford a $3,000 dress. You assumed that I was too poor, too ignorant, too inferior to be shopping in my own store. And then you laughed. Actually laughed when I asked to speak with the owner." Brad's legs were shaking now. He could see his entire future crumbling before his eyes. His entitled attitude, his assumptions about people who didn't look like him, his smug superiority, all of it was being exposed under the harsh light of reality. "I'm sorry," Brad said, his voice cracking. "I didn't mean, I was just trying to help." "Help?" Dennis's voice rose slightly, and everyone in the store could hear the anger beneath her controlled exterior. "You told me that the owner was a successful businesswoman who would never waste her time with someone like me. You were talking about me, Brad. You were saying that I would never waste my time with myself." The irony was so thick it was suffocating. Here was Brad, a 26-year-old sales associate, never built anything, never created anything, never achieved anything of significance, telling the woman who had built a multi-million-dollar empire that she wasn't worthy of her own success. Dennis turned her attention back to Jennifer. "And then we get to the credit card incident. Tell David what you did with my credit card, Jennifer." Jennifer's voice was barely audible. I called it suspicious." "You called it suspicious," Dennis repeated. "A platinum credit card with a credit limit of $200,000. A card that's literally connected to the accounts that fund this entire operation. You held it up to the light like it was a fake ID, announced to the entire store that it looked suspicious, and called for verification. You turned me into a spectacle, a criminal, a fraud, all while other customers watched and whispered." Mrs. Hamilton, who had been standing quietly near the back of the store, stepped forward. Her face was streaked with tears, and when she spoke, her voice was shaking with emotion. "I watched the whole thing," she said, looking directly at David. "I've been shopping in luxury stores for 40 years, and I have never seen anything so disgusting in my life. That woman, Miss Sterling, was treated like a criminal for trying to spend money in her own store. And I said nothing. I stood there and said nothing while it happened, and I will regret that for the rest of my life." Dennis looked at Mrs. Hamilton with something that might have been gratitude. "Thank you for speaking up now, Mrs. Hamilton. That takes courage." But Dennis wasn't finished with her employees. She turned to Marcus, the security guard who had escorted her out. "Marcus, tell David how you felt about what you were asked to do." Marcus straightened up, his military training evident in his posture. When he spoke, his voice was steady but filled with regret. "I was uncomfortable, sir. Very uncomfortable. The lady hadn't done anything wrong. She was polite, she was respectful, she wasn't causing any trouble. But I was told to escort her out, and I followed orders. I should have questioned those orders. I should have spoken up. I failed in my duty to do what was right." Dennis nodded slowly. "At least you're honest about it, Marcus. At least you recognize that following unjust orders doesn't absolve you of responsibility." Brad, meanwhile, was starting to realize that his career wasn't just over. It was destroyed so completely that he might never work in retail again. The panic was setting in, and with it came the kind of desperate pleading that makes people say things they later regret. "Please," Brad said, his voice rising to almost a whine. "I need this job. I have student loans, I have rent, I have bills. I can't afford to lose this job. I was just doing what I thought was right. I was trying to protect the store. I'm not a bad person. I'm not racist. I have black friends. I voted for Obama. This is all just a misunderstanding." The silence that followed Brad's pathetic plea was deafening. Everyone in the store, David, Mrs. Hamilton, even the other customers who were still watching this unfold, could hear the hollow ring of his excuses. Dennis looked at Brad with something that might have been pity. "Brad, the fact that you think having black friends or voting for Obama somehow excuses your behavior, tells me everything I need to know about who you are as a person. Your actions today weren't a misunderstanding. They were a choice. You chose to treat me with disrespect. You chose to judge me based on my race. You chose to laugh at the idea that someone like me could be successful. Those were choices, and choices have consequences. Jennifer, seeing Brad's desperate pleading fail so spectacularly, decided to try a different approach. She straightened up, tried to recover some of her earlier authority, and looked Dennis in the eye. "With all due respect, Miss Sterling," Jennifer said, her voice carrying a hint of defiance, "we were doing what we thought was best for the company. We were trying to maintain the kind of clientele that spends serious money here. We were protecting the brand." The audacity of Jennifer's statement hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Here was a woman who had just been caught red-handed discriminating against her own boss, and she was still trying to justify her actions. Dennis's response was swift and devastating. "Jennifer, you just said that maintaining our clientele requires keeping people who look like me out of the store. You just said that protecting our brand means discriminating against Black customers. You just proved, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that you are exactly the kind of person who should never represent my company." Then Dennis did something that transformed the entire atmosphere in the store. She began to speak about why she had built her company, about what it was to represent, about the promise she had made to her mother's memory. Her voice became softer, more personal, but somehow more powerful. "When I was 12 years old," Dennis said, her voice carrying to every corner of the store, "my mother and I were humiliated in a department store very much like this one. We were treated like we didn't belong, like we weren't worthy of basic human dignity, like the color of our skin made us less than human. My mother made me promise that day that if I ever had the power to change things, I would." The entire store was hanging on every word. Even the customers who had been trying to shop quietly had stopped to listen. "I built this company to be different," Dennis continued. "Every store, every policy, every hiring decision was supposed to reflect the values that were beaten into me that day in Detroit. Respect, dignity, inclusion, the radical idea that every person who walks through our doors deserves to be treated like a human being, regardless of what they look like or where they come from." Dennis's voice began to rise, filled with passion and pain and righteous anger. "I didn't build this empire so that people like Jennifer and Brad could use it as a platform for their prejudices. I didn't work 18-hour days for 15 years so that my stores could become places where people are judged by the color of their skin. I didn't sacrifice everything to create something that would perpetuate the same discrimination that nearly destroyed my mother." David Chen, who had been listening to this entire confrontation with growing horror and admiration, stepped forward. "Miss Sterling," he said firmly, "I want you to know that you have my complete support in whatever decisions you make here today. What happened in this store is unacceptable, and it doesn't represent the values of our company or the standards you've set for us." Dennis nodded at David, grateful for his support but not surprised by it. David had been with the company long enough to understand what it really stood for. "Thank you, David," Dennis said. "Now let's talk about consequences." The word consequences hung in the air like a sword ready to fall. Jennifer and Brad both looked like they were about to faint. "Jennifer Walsh," Dennis said, her voice now carrying the full authority of the CEO who had built an empire from nothing, "you are terminated immediately. Your access to all company systems has been revoked. Your final paycheck will be mailed to you within the legally required time frame. You will be escorted from the premises by corporate security, and you are banned from all Luxe Boutique locations permanently." Jennifer's legs gave out completely. She slumped against the counter, her face a mask of shock and disbelief. The reality of what had just happened was hitting her like a freight train. Her career in luxury retail was over. The termination would follow her to every job interview, every background check, every attempt to rebuild her life. Brad Morrison, Dennis continued, her voice as cold and final as a judge reading a death sentence. You are also terminated immediately. Same conditions. You will be escorted out, your access is revoked, and you are permanently banned from our stores. Brad's response was immediate and pathetic. He dropped to his knees, actually dropped to his knees in the middle of the store, in front of customers, in front of everyone. Please, he sobbed. Please don't do this. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'll do anything. I'll take sensitivity training. I'll work for free. Please, I can't lose this job. The sight of a grown man groveling on the floor of a luxury boutique was uncomfortable for everyone present, but Dennis looked down at him with no trace of sympathy. Brad, she said quietly, the time for apologies was before you humiliated me. The time for sensitivity training was before you decided that people like me don't belong in a place like this. You made your choices, and now you get to live with them. Then Dennis turned to Marcus, and her voice softened slightly. Marcus, you were put in an impossible position today. You were given orders by your supervisor, and your military training taught you to follow orders. But you also knew in your heart that what you were doing was wrong, and you did it anyway. That's something you're going to have to live with. Marcus stood at attention, waiting for his fate to be decided. However, Dennis continued, you've shown honesty about what happened, you've admitted your mistake, and you've taken responsibility for your actions. That means something to me. You can keep your job, but there are conditions. Marcus nodded, relief flooding his face. You will undergo immediate diversity and sensitivity training, Dennis said. You will attend workshops on unconscious bias. You will learn to recognize when orders conflict with basic human decency, and you will learn to speak up when that happens. Can you commit to that? Yes, ma'am, Marcus said firmly. Absolutely. Thank you for the second chance. Dennis nodded. Don't waste it. But Dennis wasn't finished. The terminations were just the beginning. She turned to David with the kind of focused intensity that had built her empire. David, I want an emergency review of policies at every single store in our chain. I want mandatory training for all employees, not just the new hires, but everyone. I want mystery shoppers from diverse backgrounds testing our stores every month. I want detailed reports on every complaint, every incident, every situation where a customer feels unwelcome. David was already taking notes on his phone. Consider it done, Miss Sterling. I'll have teams in place by next week. And I want it clear to every manager, every sales associate, every security guard in our company that discrimination will result in immediate termination. No warnings, no second chances, no excuses. Anyone who treats a customer with disrespect because of their race, their gender, their sexuality, their religion, or any other factor will be out the door so fast their head will spin. If you're watching this and thinking about how you'd handle discrimination in your own workplace, hit that subscribe button, because we need more people who are willing to stand up for what's right. And let me ask you this. Do you think Dennis was too harsh with Jennifer and Brad? Or did they get exactly what they deserved? Drop your thoughts in the comments. As the corporate security team escorted Jennifer and Brad from the store, Jennifer maintaining what little dignity she had left, Brad still sobbing and pleading, Dennis turned to address the remaining staff and customers. I want everyone here to understand something, Dennis said, her voice carrying throughout the store. This company was built on the principle that every person deserves respect and dignity. Today, that principle was violated in the worst possible way. But what happened here today will never happen again. Not in this store, not in any store that bears my name. Mrs. Hamilton stepped forward, her face still streaked with tears. Miss Sterling, she said, I want to apologize for not speaking up earlier. I should have said something when I saw what was happening. I should have stood up for you. Dennis looked at the older woman with something approaching warmth. Mrs. Hamilton, the fact that you're speaking up now means something. The fact that you recognize what was wrong means something. We can't change what happened, but we can learn from it. Mrs. Hamilton nodded, then surprised everyone by saying, I'd like to make a purchase. Several purchases, actually. I want to support what you're building here. The transformation of the store's atmosphere was remarkable. What had been a place of tension and discrimination just an hour earlier was becoming something different. A place where people were learning, growing, changing. The remaining staff members were looking at Dennis with a mixture of awe and terror, finally understanding that their actions had consequences, and that treating people with respect wasn't just a nice idea, it was a requirement. Dennis spent the next few minutes personally greeting every customer in the store, apologizing for what they had witnessed and ensuring that they understood this wasn't representative of her company's values. Some customers left, clearly uncomfortable with the drama, but others, like Mrs. Hamilton, seemed inspired by what they had seen. As the immediate crisis wound down, Dennis gathered the remaining staff around her. Her voice was calmer now, but still carried that unmistakable authority. "I want to be very clear about something," she said. "What happened here today was not just a failure of customer service. It was a moral failure. It was a betrayal of everything this company stands for. And while I've addressed the most serious offenders, I want every single person who works here to understand that your job is not just to sell clothes. Your job is to represent my brand, my values, and my commitment to treating every human being with dignity and respect." She paused, looking each remaining employee in the eye. "If you can't do that, if you can't treat every customer, regardless of their race, their appearance, their perceived economic status, with the same respect you'd show your own family, then you need to find another job. Because I will not tolerate discrimination in any form, and I will not allow my company to be used as a platform for prejudice." The message was clear, and the fear in the employees' faces showed that it had been received loud and clear. As Dennis prepared to leave the store, she took one last look around the space she had created. In a few hours, this place would be operating under new management, with new policies, and hopefully with a new understanding of what it meant to represent her brand. "David," she said quietly, "I want weekly reports on this location for the next 6 months. I want to know about every customer interaction, every complaint, every success story. This store is going to become a model for how we treat people, or it's going to close. Those are the only two options." David nodded. "Understood, Miss Sterling. It will be a model." 6 months later, the Soho location had indeed become a model. Not just for Luxe Boutique, but for luxury retail in general. The story of what happened that day had spread throughout the industry, becoming a case study in how to handle discrimination and what happens when prejudice meets consequences. Mrs. Hamilton had become one of the store's best customers and biggest advocates, often bringing friends to shop there specifically because of how the company had handled the situation. Marcus had completed his training and become an advocate for diversity and inclusion, often speaking to new employees about the importance of treating every customer with respect. And Dennis? She continued to visit her stores unannounced, not to test her employees, but to ensure that the promise she had made to her mother's memory was being kept in every location that bore her name. Because in the end, that's what this was all about. Keeping a promise to a woman who had been humiliated in a store just like this one, and making sure that no one else would ever have to experience what they had experienced that day in Detroit. The store that had been a symbol of discrimination had become a symbol of redemption, proving that when prejudice meets real consequences, change is not just possible, it's inevitable. If you enjoyed this story, like, subscribe, and share with others so they can learn too. See you in our next video.